We've been looking for a theory of consciousness that links neural activity to perceptual experience and decision making for a long time. But before we delve into the theoretical framework you've created, could you say something more generally about the role of theory in science?
I think theory has a really important role in science. As neuroscientists, we don't always appreciate that. But we always work within a paradigm, whether we formally recognize that or not. And if our current paradigm does not fully explain everything that's happening in the system under investigation, then it's worth considering a shift to a new theoretical framework.
What is your definition of consciousness?
Operationally, I think that consciousness is how we perceive our world, learn about our world, build mental models of our world, store and access memories, and how we compile all of this information together to decide our actions. And I think that all of these things, perception, cognition, memory, decision-making, are part of a singular process of neural computation.
Why do you think consciousness is a neural process?
So if consciousness is defined as awareness, perception, cognition, memory, and decision-making, then we know that all of these processes are dependent on neural activity in the cerebral cortex. So that means that consciousness itself is dependent on neural activity in the cerebral cortex. And we actually know a lot about the neural correlates of consciousness. We know that the claustrum is required for wakeful awareness. We know that neural activity in the visual cortex is required for visual perception. We know that neural activity in the auditory cortex is required for auditory perception. And we know that cognitive models require memory formation. And we know that memory formation requires remodeling of synaptic connections between cortical neurons. And we know that decision-making is a process of integrating incoming sensory input with our cognitive models. And that process of decision-making is associated with increasing activity in the lateral intraparietal cortex. And once a decision is made, those neurons signal to supplementary motor cortex and primary motor cortex, which direct behavioral output. And so we know a lot about the neural correlates of consciousness, the neural correlates of perception and awareness and cognition and memory and decision-making. But what we don't understand is how cortical neural networks can actually give rise to this qualitative experience of perception, and how our thoughts, goals, and cognitive models can influence our decision-making. That's what's called the hard problem, and that's what we're trying to solve.
How can something as intangible as perception be related to something as physical as neural activity?
I think this question absolutely gets to the heart of things. And, traditionally we talk about physical processes in terms of interactions between matter and energy. And I think the best way to move forward here is to start talking about physical processes in terms of interactions between matter, energy, and information.
What is information?
Information actually has two definitions. The mathematical definition of information is the number of possible states of a system. And so bandwidth, the size of a communication channel, will actually limit the amount of information that can come through. So in mathematical terms, the quantity of information actually increases with randomness. But our everyday definition of information is kind of the opposite. We take a random, messy data set and we parse it for meaning. We extract a signal from the noise. And ultimately, I think it'll be useful to consider these two different definitions of information as part of a singular process, where we create a messy data set through the random accumulation of events over time, and then we parse this data set for meaning. We extract the signal from the noise. And in doing so, in going through this process, we gain a better understanding of our world.
What is entropy?
Entropy also has two definitions. In mathematical terms, entropy is almost identical to information. It's the sum of all possible system states. But it not only accounts for the amount of time that has passed to reach that set of possible states, it also accounts for the temperature of the system. And so entropy can be considered like a physical analog of information. Entropy also has another definition. In thermodynamics and engineering, entropy is the amount of energy lost to the system, the amount of energy that is unavailable to do work. And again, I think it's useful to consider both of these definitions as part of a singular process. Somehow, a physical system expends energy to create a set of possible system states. And in most systems, that probability density is irreversibly lost to the past as the system continues to operate. However, what I am proposing is that in non-equilibrium thermodynamic systems that encode information about their environment, that probability density can be maintained and the optimal system state can be selected in the present context as the system performs a computation and extracts the signals from the noise.
Do neurons encode information or entropy?
I think it's worth talking about neurons in terms of both information and entropy. Classically, we think of neurons as encoding information, but we don't always talk about the energy expended to do so. And when we take that into account, we find something really interesting. Simple neural circuits, like spinal reflex circuits, are only about 50% energy efficient. And that's to be expected. Any physical system has some level of inefficiency. But when we look at cortical neural circuits, we find that they're about 99% energy efficient. And that's not really possible under classical assumptions. And so I think it's worth comparing how neurons process information in spinal reflex circuits versus how neurons process information in cortical neural circuitry.
How do spinal reflex circuits process information?
The spinal reflex circuit is comprised of 3 neurons: a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and a motor neuron. So when we touch a hot stove or any other painful stimulus, the sensory neuron will send a signal to the interneuron, and that interneuron will then send a signal to the alpha motor neuron, which activates flexor muscles and inhibits extensor muscles to achieve the limb withdrawal response. That sensory neuron will also send a signal to an interneuron on the other side of the body. That interneuron will signal to an alpha motor neuron, which activates extensor muscles and inhibits flexor muscles to study the contralateral limb. And so we have these really simple, elegant neural circuits which achieve a successful limb withdrawal response without any real conscious experience of pain. And even with auditory and visual stimuli, we can orient toward a loud noise or a bright flash of light with really simple neural circuits and get some actions done before we even start to consciously process what's happening.
How do cortical neural circuits process information?
Cortical neural networks are built on simpler neural circuitry. The cerebral cortex allows us to integrate information across sensory modalities, to build an understanding of the world around us, and to direct the action of our limbs to navigate that world effectively. And this integrative process is far more complicated than a spinal reflex circuit. Cortical neuron behavior is far more complicated than spinal neuron behavior. A cortical neuron is not activated by a single stimulus event, like a sensory neuron. And a cortical neuron is not activated by a single upstream signaling event, like an interneuron or an alpha motor neuron. Cortical neurons have the unique feature of integrating a bunch of upstream signals over a short window of time, and that may or may not reach the threshold for sending an output signal. What's particularly interesting about this integrative process is that it's a process of noisy coincidence detection. Cortical neurons allow stochastic charge flux to affect the probability of a state change in the computational unit, the probability of switching from an off state to an on state. And so it's easy enough to predict signaling outcomes in spinal neurons, but it is incredibly difficult to predict the firing patterns of an individual cortical neuron, which is dependent on multiple upstream factors and essentially random noise.
How does energy expenditure come into it?
Random noise actually decreases accuracy and energy efficiency in electrical circuits. And so it seems strange, considering that spinal neurons are so robust to random noise, that cortical neurons, which we think of as so much more highly evolved, would be sensitive to it, even allowing random noise to affect signaling outcomes. Random noise should decrease accuracy and energy efficiency in cortical neurons. And yet cortical neurons seem enormously energy efficient. So there's something strange going on here.
Let's back up a moment. How exactly does a neuron encode information?
A neuron sets up an electrochemical potential across the cellular membrane, and it does so through sodium-potassium ion exchange. The sodium ions are concentrated outside the cell, so there's a chemical potential. And these sodium ions can't diffuse into the cell because of the hydrophobic barrier. And so these positively charged sodium ions are outside the cell, while potassium ions and a whole lot of anions are inside the cell. So there's an electrical potential when the cell's in a resting state, with a membrane voltage at about minus 70 millivolts. So if an excitatory neurotransmitter binds to a receptor embedded on the neural membrane, that receptor changes shape and allows sodium ions to flood into the cell. At that point, the membrane resistance drops. Sodium ions trickle into the cell as a flow of current, and the voltage of the cell increases. And if that voltage reaches a certain threshold, then voltage-gated ion channels will open and sodium ions will flood into the cell. That is an action potential.
So what do you think is different between cortical neurons and subcortical neurons?
In subcortical neurons, like those in spinal reflex circuits, a single upstream event is sufficient to trigger the cell to fire a signal. These cells have deterministic outputs. They're like transistors, always in an off state or an on state. In cortical neurons, a single upstream event is not sufficient to trigger a signaling outcome. These cells have probabilistic outputs. They're not classical computing units. They're more like qubits, which calculate the probability of sending a signal. It should be said that cortical neurons actively suspend themselves right near the threshold for firing a signal. In fact, the entire population of neurons maintains this uncertain state at the same time. A cortical neuron generally needs multiple upstream signals to occur coincidentally to trigger a signaling outcome. But these cells also allow stochastic charge flux and random fluctuations in membrane potential to contribute to the probability of a state change from an off state to an on state. And that's the critical difference, allowing electrical noise to gate a state change.
How could a probabilistic state lead to a signaling outcome for each neuron?
A cortical neuron collects information from its environment, and it encodes that information it receives from upstream sources into its voltage state. And so the state of the neuron is actually dependent on the state of the environment. And remember, each neuron has some probability of being in an on state or an off state. The sum of these probability amplitudes is the entropy of the system. If there are correlations between the neuronal state and the state of the environment, that entropy is naturally reduced or compressed. These redundancies allow a signal to emerge from the noise as the optimal state of each neuron is selected. And so, as a non-equilibrium thermodynamic system is perturbed by its environment, it has to find a mutually compatible state with its environment. And that is a natural process of thermodynamic computing.
How does neuroscience currently describe cortical neuron activity? And how do you describe it?
A lot of researchers use statistical methods which describe the range of possible outcomes for a cortical neural network. But this approach doesn't really get at the mechanism underlying a state change in a particular cortical neuron. The system is not random. A cortical neural network is always taking on an optimal configuration for the present context. And so there must be some mechanism by which an optimal non-deterministic outcome is computed. And I think the best way to describe it is a two-state quantum system with each neuron acting as a qubit.
Are you arguing that quantum uncertainty is maintained in this macro-scale system?
Yes, cortical neurons spend most of their time suspended in a state of uncertainty. The cell may have reached the threshold for firing a signal, or it might not. The on or off state of the neuron depends on the state of every sodium ion in the vicinity. And the state of every sodium ion is uncertain. The state of the sodium ion is dependent on the constantly fluctuating electrochemical potential of every neuron in the vicinity and the intrinsically uncertain position, momentum, and energy state of every component electron. And when a macroscale computational unit retains sensitivity to probabilistic particle behavior with quantum level fluctuations actually gating a signaling outcome, you have a quantum computer.
How would a cortical neural network engage in quantum computing?
It may be useful to think in terms of electrons because the state of an electron will affect the on-off state of every local neuron. The state of an electron is fundamentally uncertain, and that uncertainty is maintained in the context of a cortical upstate when the electrochemical potential of every neuronal membrane is uncertain. The state of an electron is fundamentally uncertain with regards to its position along the x, y, and z coordinate plane, and with regard to its energy state or atomic orbital. The amount of time that's passed since the last measurement or detection within the system is also uncertain, and all of these values may be changing, but the exact value in the present moment is fundamentally uncertain. And so the position of an electron may be best described as a set of probability amplitudes distributed across the x, y, and z axes. And the amount of time that's passed is a set of probability amplitudes distributed across the time axis. And the energy state or atomic orbital of the electron is a set of probability amplitudes distributed across yet another axis. And so the entire state of the electron is best described as a complex valued probability density distributed across 5 orthogonal axes. Each of these axes is mutually perpendicular and independent from the others. That is, the state of an electron along one axis doesn't necessarily affect the state of that electron along another axis. However, the state of an electron does affect the state of other electrons. They exert forces on each other, and they cannot occupy the same state. And so the system has to be described as a whole. In any non-equilibrium thermodynamic system that detects temporally coincident events, particularly coincident charge flux across a barrier, time is defined, time is bounded, and that allows the other values, the other variables, to be defined as well, from acceleration to energy state, from velocity to momentum. And so just as we integrated these probability amplitudes across 5 orthogonal axes to create a complex valued probability density, we can now take the second derivative of that complex valued probability density to identify observables or eigenvalues on the boundary region, which is our observable three-dimensional space at a single point in time. This computational process reduces the total entropy of the system, thereby releasing free energy. And any entropy that is not reduced or compressed during a computational cycle remains distributed along the time and energy axes. And so this theory is really just about the conservation of matter and energy. It describes where energy goes and how entropy is distributed in a non-equilibrium thermodynamic system. That redistribution of energy through non-deterministic computation allows us to spontaneously accelerate. It allows us to choose our actions in the world.
Are you arguing that quantum information is equivalent to consciousness?
In this theory, quantum computing itself is not sufficient for consciousness. Every thermodynamic system produces entropy. And certain non-equilibrium thermodynamic systems may be able to extract predictive value from that entropy to identify the optimal system state in the present context. That's non-deterministic computation. But not every system that's capable of doing that will necessarily perceive that information content. Only a system that's capable of both capturing probabilistic particle states and internally representing that information content during the encoding process will be able to perceive the information encoded by that structure.
How is information content captured, and projected during the encoding process?
It's essentially a holographic process. We can consider each of the electrons in the system as complex waves, as probability amplitudes that are distributed across 5 orthogonal axes. These complex waves impinge on the neural membrane structure. The waves interfere with constructive and destructive interference, causing a signal to emerge from the noise. And the most dominant probability amplitudes yield a non-deterministic computational outcome. But the neuronal membrane is not just a charge detecting surface of a computational unit. It's also a polymer sheet with sufficient dimensionality to encode these interfering waves as a holographic recording surface. And so in biological neural networks, the encoding process is paired with a holographic projection, which provides a cohesive representation of the information content that is being encoded by the structure. And that information is limited by the range and sensitivity of the sensory apparatus, and it's continually updated as new sensory input becomes available. And so in this theory, multisensory perception is a holographic projection of quantum information that is encoded by the polymer neural membrane structure as it undergoes non-deterministic computation.
How would you summarize the theory?
The theory describes cortical neuron computation in terms of thermodynamics, mechanics, and holography. And what's interesting is that all 3 mathematical models yield the exact same cyclical process of quantum information generation and compression. And all 3 models yield perceptual experience and contextually appropriate output behavior naturally arising from neural activity in the cerebral cortex. And so the theory suggests that consciousness is something that's contained entirely within ourselves, that we are quantum computers capable of perceiving our world, building an understanding of our world, and effectively navigating our world through behavior.
How would you know if the theory is wrong?
This theory is new, and it needs to be empirically tested before it can be accepted into the mainstream. It provides over 24 specific and falsifiable predictions, which are grounded in neuroscience and physics, and which could be evaluated in the laboratory. If the predicted events are observed, then that would provide support for the theory. And if the predicted events are not observed, that would undermine the theory, and we'd have to go looking for a better explanation.
In this theory, what are the physical requirements for consciousness?
There are a number of criteria that would have to be met for a system to manifest consciousness. There are specific minimum requirements for Coulomb scattering of ions at the polymer membrane of the neuron or the computational unit. There are minimum requirements for decoherence timescales that would have to be coordinated across the entire neural network. To undergo non-deterministic computation, there has to be hardware instantiation of a thermoregulated quantum computer with multiple sensory apparatus to acquire data and some mechanism to direct motor output. And for a system to actually perceive that computing process as it's parsing data and identifying consistencies in the data set, there are specific material requirements and dimensionality requirements for each computational unit to capture that signal and effectively project that stream of information content holographically.
Who or what is consciousness?
I think this is an important question and an empirical one. But we can't really evaluate this question unless we have a theoretical framework that actually describes the structural and functional requirements for consciousness. So I would say that any hardware instantiated biological or engineered system that retains sensitivity to probabilistic particle behavior and whose signaling outcomes are at least partially dependent on quantum oscillations can achieve non-deterministic computation. And if those macro-scale computational units have sufficient dimensionality and material characteristics, then incoming sensory input will be perceivable to the system as it's undergoing a non-deterministic computation. So it's not enough to have sensory input and motor output. You need probabilistic computation and effective representation. And if the structural and functional requirements are met, then consciousness should be possible in either biological or engineered systems.
What does it mean to be a purely physical entity, living in a purely physical world?
To be a purely physical entity, operating in accordance with physical laws, may seem devastatingly empty to a lot of people. I get that, but this theory doesn't take anything away. It says that consciousness is real. It's a process that we can understand, and it's a gift that we can use. Having an explanation and some set of criteria for consciousness may actually open our eyes to our humble place in the universe. We may be one species among many who is conscious and capable of understanding the world. And each of us, with a unique combination of sensory apparatus and perspective on the world, is capable of deriving some small truth about the world through observation. And if we value each other and the knowledge that each of us has gained, then we can build a better understanding of the world together. And that may mean bridging toward other individuals and even other species who are very different from us.
Do you think that a physical theory of consciousness can say anything about meaning and purpose?
I absolutely believe that a physical theory of consciousness can help us define meaning and purpose in our lives. If we consider consciousness as a process of neural computation with incoming sensory data accumulating to form cognitive models, and we use this information to decide our actions, then consciousness is absolutely a process of understanding our world and choosing what to do with the time we have. And the better we understand what's true about our world, the more effectively we can shape the future with our actions today.